In a few seconds, we should be live.
It's working.
So, good morning, those of us in the Americas, from Alaska to Ushuaia. It's 11 in the morning. Good afternoon to some of you. Good evening to the rest, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for joining us again. I'm losing track, but I think this must be already our 5th or 6th weekly meeting of the Frontiers in Social Evolution seminar. And before I introduce our speaker today, for those of you, I see pretty much all familiar faces. I hope you will bear with me in going over the standard weekly announcements that we like to make, is in case that we have somebody who is new to the group. So our speaker will be presented for some time around 45-50 minutes, so that will take us roughly to around noon. And after that time, we will have about an hour of time for questions and answers. I continue to be so thankful and so impressed by how many of you stay. I mean, you have managed to fit this seminar and the questions and answers period into your very, very busy schedule. We have stayed most of the weeks definitely until 1 p.m. New York time, sometimes even longer than that, talking to the speaker, engaging, listening from students who have lots and lots of fascinating questions, and sometimes going on different topics that relate, if not to social evolution per se, to other issues that are important to our profession, or sometimes even to our societies, whatever your society happens to be these days. I'll remind some of this at the end, how we handle the questions and answers, so probably no need to say it now, otherwise we will be repeating. I think that's all I have. So I can then introduce our speaker, Dr. Sarie Van Belle. I've been very lucky to have known Sarie for a long, long time. So I've known her longer than she thinks I've known her. We know how it is when we read grants and papers of our soon-to-be colleagues, and you're always, I mean, sometimes you're very impressed from their very, very first pieces of work that you get to read. More recently, but already in the last 10 years, Sarie joined our project together with Tony Di Fiore and Michael Hook. You listen to me present on this kind of comparative approach we have to the study of pair living and sexual monogamy in primates in the neotropics. So she's also been a huge contributor to some of the major pieces of writing that we published last year. But her research, the focus of her research and the project that she will be describing to us today is something that started with her PhD. She did her PhD at the University of Wisconsin under the guidance of Karen Stryer, who is joining us today as well. And since then, she has been studying, she developed a research system in Palenque National Park in Mexico, where she's been studying howler monkeys. And in particular, she's always been very interested, and that's the connection to social evolution, in understanding the dynamics between groups and the role that the different age classes and the sexes play in articulating, in regulating the spacing between various groups of howlers. She has tackled that in a range of ways. I mean, some of those illustrated in the 3 papers that she assigned. I mean, she's looked at these questions from whatever angles genetics can give us. She's done endocrinology. She's done very, very detailed, thorough behavioral analysis of how individuals function within groups and how groups function within a community of howler monkeys in Palenque National Park. Today, she will bring all that together in a talk that she's titled Intergroup Dynamics in Howler Monkeys. So with this, I just want to welcome Sarie. Sarie, please, thank you for joining us. And I think we should be ready. We practiced all this before, so you're a co-host, so I think you should be ready to share your screen and take it from here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Eduardo, for this nice introduction.
Okay, it looks fine. I hear you well. Please, people, give me a nod or a thumb if you have any problems, but it looks like we're all okay, ready to go. You're in charge.
All right. Well, thanks again, Eduardo, for this nice introduction. And I actually want to start off with saying that I'm honored to be presenting within this seminar series. I'm enjoying participating every week and learning about the different research projects and animal species. But today I will talk about the importance of intergroup relationships within the social system.
Excuse me, sorry, we can see all your notes. You probably want to go into presenter mode.
I am.
We can see your notes.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
Thanks, Karen. So how do we do that?
This looks like
that works. Oh, no, now whatever you just did went back to your notes. But we could see it for a minute. Go back, move, try it again.
Yes, but then I don't see my notes, Karen. That's the...
You have to use a second device, sorry, to see your notes. If you work on a Mac, it won't let you do the presenter view.
Sorry, you don't need your notes. You can talk off of this. I know you can do this without your notes.
I don't. All right. I'm not prepared for that one, but here we go. I was just saying that, yes.
Take a second if you want. You should be able. Somebody was saying how there are other options. If you go to PowerPoint and go to the various views, try again. If instead of choosing the one you chose, which is the one that's giving us the full screen, there is one that should allow you to have. If somebody has been through this before, you have any suggestions, please speak up, but try again.
Yeah,
that's why we started. Julia?
Yeah, I think one option is actually to just show a part of your screen. So you can select a sub part of your screen, which would be the part that is the actual slides. And then you can see the whole thing and we can see only the slide. I think that was a workaround for somebody in one of the previous.
That would be a setting that you adjust in Zoom, not on your PowerPoint. So if you go to your share screen option, that's where you should be able to adjust that.
I was freaking out going live 5 minutes ago. So relax, because for some of us, all this is always every week stressful and challenging. So we have no rush, we're on time. Let's figure it out.
I'm sorry, guys.
You might want to try, like, stop the share screen for a moment, and then you can reshare your screen and select a different option that would just be the PowerPoint presentation rather than your entire screen.
So when you do share screen, and it gives you the option to choose which one to share, just choose the PowerPoint tab, so to speak, as opposed to the computer.
That's the option. If you have a spare laptop, have one open that's not connected to Zoom.
So you guys now see my screen, right?
Now we see it like we would like to see it, just only the slide, not your notes.
If I do this,
we still just see your presentation.
Forward it one slide, make sure it stays that way.
Change slides once to see if, there we go, we got it. See?
That's it.
Thank you very much for your patience, guys.
Teamwork works.
All right, here we go. So just like other talks we heard in the seminar series, I will start off with an overview of the 4 domains in which we can subdivide the social system, recently reviewed by Peter Kapler. So social organization, social structure, mating system, and care system. And it is between group relationships is considered within the social structure, the domain that encompasses the social relationships among conspecifics. Yet, if we look at the definition of that domain, it says that the social structure is defined by the content, quality, and patterning of social relationships emerging from a repeated interaction between pairs of individuals belonging to the same social unit. It is then not surprising that an often neglected aspect of social structure concerns relationships between neighboring social units, which can vary massively in mutual tolerance. And I would agree with that, for example, in these 2 fairly recent volumes, reviewing the functioning and evolution of animal societies, there is no chapter dedicated to intergroup dynamics, and it's only mentioned by passing, and that despite the many published papers on this topic. But we know that intergroup competition mediates many aspects of animal societies, including group composition through the death of combatants, infanticide, group takeovers, or individuals transferring to neighboring groups during intergroup encounters. Between group competition may also influence space use in terms of access to resources, the amount of overlap among home ranges, and the strategies employed to defend resources. Between group competition may also impact groups' movement patterns, both pre and post conflict, as well as intra-group relationships by promoting cooperation during conflict, but it may also influence affiliative and aggressive interactions post-conflict. And all these factors in turn influence individuals' reproductive success, and thus this underscores the importance of intergroup dynamics in animal societies. My own research focuses on 3 main research lines. 1, the social relationships among group members, including the underlying kinship patterns and the reproductive strategies of both males and females. I also study intra-group coordination and decision-making with a focus on leadership and collective movements in navigation strategies, as well as intergroup dynamics, including individual strategies during collective group defense and the role of loud calls in intergroup spacing. And I investigate these concepts between demographic and ecological settings that fluctuate over time. And with this research framework, I aim to obtain a well-rounded assessment of how these 3 levels integrate and impact individual fitness. And with that, I want to help to better understand the nature and evolution of social systems in animals. I have established a long-term research project on black howler monkeys that has been running for 15 years now. And the field site is Palenque National Park in southeastern Mexico, and that park safeguards the remains of a Mayan city of Palenque, some of the buildings you see in the picture. And more than 90% of the city is still covered by tropical forest, and it's obviously in that forest that these howler monkeys live. This project was established in collaboration with my colleagues Alejandro Estrada and Elsa Barrios, actually without whom this would never be possible. And over the course of the project, I have been studying 7 groups. I started off with a pilot study in 2005, followed by a 14-month dissertation project. And after graduating, I returned full-time to the field and gradually added new groups while others disintegrated. Black howler groups are composed of 1 to 3 adult males and 1 to 4 adult females and up to 7 immatures. So they are fairly small groups. And the most notorious behavior of howler monkeys is their loud calls, which is considered one of the loudest calls made by land animals. And here in this video, you will see an adult male on your left and an adult female on your right, calling together during an intergroup encounter. And I hope that the sounds works. Here we go. So you can see the effort that they invest in these howlings, and groups can produce on average 1.5 calling bouts per day. And this lasts on average 14 minutes, during which they combine roars and barks. And in this video, you mostly heard roars. They produce calling bouts in several contexts, including spontaneously when there is no apparent external stimulus, in response to calls by neighbors without visual contact with the callers, or during intergroup encounters when they have visual contact with their neighbors, and calling bouts last longer during these intergroup encounters. They call throughout the day, but with a pronounced peak right before sunrise, and both spontaneous and response calls occur throughout the home range, while those during intergroup encounters occur closer to the home range border, given the minimal overlap between these home ranges. And today I will specifically talk about the role of these calls as an intergroup spacing mechanism, group members' participation in these calls, and how they can convey information on group level resource holding potential. So starting off with the first. In that study, I investigated whether black howler monkeys use loud calls as a mutual avoidance intergroup spacing mechanism. Loud calls do not only reveal the current locations of these callers, but the acoustic characteristics of the calls may also convey information on callers' identity, competitive abilities, motivational state, group size, and other features, and this in turn can elicit a response in nearby listeners who can decide to either move towards, away, or ignore the callers. So overall, I predicted that groups will more readily move away from their calling neighbors, yet navigation decisions can be influenced by the motivational level of the calling group, which I measured through call duration, with focal groups being less likely to approach their neighbors after long calling bouts. I also predicted that relative competitive ability of both groups would influence navigation decisions. Focal groups will be less likely to approach groups that outnumber them in terms of adult males. I predicted that focal groups will be more likely to approach their neighbors when they were close to their home range border or when food was scarce. And lastly, I predicted that the presence of infants in the group will elicit a response of retreat. Now, in terms of rates of intergroup encounters, I would predict that rates would be lower than expected by chance. So this was a study of 16 months with 5 groups, and on an all occurrence basis, we recorded all the travel bouts, their start and end times, their path and the directions. And we also recorded all the calls of all neighboring groups. And for that, we recorded the start and end times of these calls, the group's identity whenever that was possible, the location of the focal group, the direction of the call relative to that location. And we estimated the distance using these distance categories. We also collected phonology data. And we conducted multinomial logistic regression models given that the response variable has 3 categorical outcomes. We excluded from the analysis those calls during intergroup encounters or those that were too far away. And the focal group had to travel within the next hour after the loud call had ended for it to be included in the analysis. And we had 5 predictive variables, obviously according to our predictions. And starting off simply with the chi-square test, groups were more likely to approach calling neighbors than what would be expected by chance. And we would expect 25% of the time that they would approach their neighbors. I'm not really going into too much detail of the logistic regression results, but basically only the scores of food availability of mature fruits had an effect. When mature fruits were scarce, groups were more likely to approach their neighbors, suggesting that they were willing to confront their neighbors when important resources are limited. I also compared the observed rates of intergroup encounters with what would be expected if each group were to move independently from one another. I calculated for that rates per pair of neighboring group, and we had 5 pairs of neighboring groups. But to compare that with what would be expected by chance, but also take into account the home range shape and the landscape features and vegetation structure, I simulated rates of intergroup encounters by randomly selecting daily paths among all observed daily paths for each of these 2 groups. And I scored an intergroup encounter whenever these 2 paths came within 50 meters of one another. And I have like this little demonstration to make this clearer. Now I did that 100 times to be able to calculate a rate over 100 simulated days. And I did that then 100 times to obtain a distribution of 100 expected rates against which I could compare the observed rate. And for the 5 pairs of neighboring groups, they encountered each other some 5 times more frequently than what would be expected by chance. So there is no evidence of loud calls functioning in a mutual avoidance mechanism. And in fact, groups were more likely to approach calling neighbors, particularly when important food resources were limited, and neighbors encountered each other more frequently than what would be expected by chance. So now moving on to the second part, looking at individual participation. Behaviors associated with collective group defense, for example, vigilance or aggression of vocal displays towards neighboring groups, provide benefits to both the actor of that behavior as well as all other group members, because the benefits, such as maintaining access to the home range, are not monopolizable. All group members obtain the benefit of maintaining access to that same home range. And so such type of cooperation is vulnerable to free riding group members, and those are the individuals who refrain from participating in the collective action and therefore incur no cost, yet they reap the benefits of successful group actions displayed by these other group members. And it is thus intriguing that such collective actions can evolve. And the collective action framework examines individuals' motivation to contribute to the collective action by analyzing the cost-benefit trade-offs based on sex, age, social status, the physical condition, reproductive success, as well as the number and actions of the alliance partners. But we observe cooperative group defense in many social animal species, and thus the collective action can be overcome despite the potential of free riding. And one way this can be overcome is when the benefits are not evenly distributed among all group members, and those individuals who benefit the most are the most willing to provide to collective action. Now, cooperation may also benefit through kinship and gains in inclusive fitness, and free riding is expected to be lower and cooperation higher among kin than among non-kin residents. But then kinship is not a prerequisite of cooperation, and the strength of social relationships and partner competence might be even more important than kinship to actually understand collective actions. So we also need to consider the differences between males and females, as they may play different roles in collective group defense. And given that male fitness is limited to access to females, their participation is generally thought of to reflect the defense of females. They can do that directly or indirectly. And if they do that indirectly, they can defend resources that females need to successfully reproduce, or by defending infants vulnerable to infanticide. Female fitness, on the other hand, is limited by access to resources, and their participation in collective group defense is most likely to reflect the defense of resources or the defense of their infants. And depending on the species or the demographic, social, or ecological conditions, the primary participants may be either males or females. Now, taking a step back and going back to the black howlers and getting some background information on their social structure, genetic analysis have revealed that most resident adult females are genetically related and form matrilines, although that is not true for all groups. And for males, resident males may or may not be related, but yet virtually all sons disperse from the natal groups. So the groups that are with males that are related are not necessarily father-son dyads. Now, given these kinship patterns, females form the core of these groups, and they've spent considerable time together and frequently engage in affiliative interactions. Males barely spend time together, and they barely interact with one another, and this is either affiliatively and agonistically, and their relationships are based on tolerance and avoidance. Nevertheless, when we look at the proximity patterns between males and females, a distinction between resident males become apparent. And this graph shows the percentage of time that resident males spent within 1 meter of at least one resident females, and this in two groups, the Belums and the Motiepas. And during this 14-month study, these groups underwent changes in male group memberships, and this is depicted by the different periods per group, 3 for the Belum and 2 for Motiepas. And within each of these periods, one male spent significantly more time close to females compared to the other resident males rather. And we call these males the central males and the other males non-central males. And we chose those terms to not have to insinuate that male social status is based on male-male aggression. Now, what does that actually mean for male reproductive strategies? For that, I mapped copulations onto ovarian cycles. And in this graph, the x-axis represents days relative to the estimated day of ovulation based on progesterone and estrogen profiles. And that day is set at 0. And the periovulatory period is defined as 3 days before till 3 days after this periovulatory, after this estimated day of ovulation rather. And that is the period when conception is most likely to occur. And copulations were mostly confined to this periovulatory period, and central males monopolized almost all reproductive opportunities, leading to a high reproductive skew. Now, if we consider the hormonal profiles between central and non-central males, and during that periovulatory period in black and outside that period in gray, there was no differences in hormonal profiles across the ovarian cycles, but central males had consistently higher glucocorticoid and androgen levels than non-central males. And this suggests that despite minimal agonism among males, resident males still seem to compete indirectly and non-aggressively with one another by fostering relationships with resident females. So, given this background information and going back to examining individual strategies during collective group defense, I have 4 predictions about male participation. If uneven distribution of benefits influence male participation, then males who sire offspring should howl more frequently than males without offspring in that group. If kinship plays a role, then pairs of males who are kin should howl together more frequently than non-kin pairs. If rather the strength of social relationship is important, then pairs of males that form close spatial association should howl mutually more frequently than pairs with more distant spatial associations. And finally, if the threat level of opponents influence male participations, then males should howl more frequently when opponents are within visual range during intergroup encounters than when they have no visual contact with opponents. For females, I explored 3 predictions. Now, the first one is a bit complicated. If females mainly defend infants, then females should howl either more or less frequently when they have infants vulnerable to infanticide than when they have no infants. On the one hand, females are predicted to participate less, given that females with infants bear higher costs. On the other hand, females with unweaned infants might participate more when their participation influence the balance of power between opposing groups, and thus their participation leads to a higher probability of winning the contest. And so overall, those females accrue higher benefits relative to the costs. But females may also just defend resources, and if they do that, females should howl more frequently when they are in the immediate vicinity of important food resources than when they have no food resources nearby. Or, as is the case with males, if the threat level of opponents influence female participations, then they should participate more during intergroup encounters. So this was a 28-month study on 5 groups. And for each howling bout of that focal group, I recorded at a 1-minute interval the participation of all adult and sub-adult group members of both sexes, and this could be up to 7 individuals. Now, given that these howling bouts last on average 14 minutes and some go on for over an hour, and given that these are arboreal animals that don't necessarily sit still, I wasn't always successful to doing that. And so in the analysis, I only included in the howling bouts, I only included those howling bouts for which all individuals were in sight during at least 80% of these scan samples. And that resulted in 387 bouts analyzed, coming from over 600 that were recorded. Now, I also conducted genetic analysis, and this was through a long-term collaboration with Tony Di Fiore at the University of Texas at Austin. And the paternity analysis of 19 offspring revealed that in 3 groups, the central male was the most likely sire of the offspring, while in 2 groups, Balam and Motiepa, 2 males sired the offspring. Now, for the 387 calling bouts analyzed, I calculated for each individual the percentage of time they participated. And this graph shows the mean percentage each group member participated across all calling bouts, and that for these 5 groups. And it's immediately clear that adult males are the primary participants, yet sub-adult males and adult females also regularly participated. Now, focusing only on the adult males, For two groups, Balam and Motiepa, both adult males frequently called. For the other two groups that had at least two adults, and this is Pakala and Unites, there were more differences in male participation. Now, looking into more detail, adult males participated significantly more than subadult males, and among the adult males, those that had sired offspring in the group participated significantly more than males without offspring in the group. Kinship had no effect on the percentage of time pairs of males held together, nor did the percentage of time that pairs of males spent within 2 meters of one another. Now, focusing on the adult females now, at least one female participated in 53% of the calling bouts. Now, in the first 4 groups that you see, one female called significantly more than did all the other resident females. Having an infant vulnerable to infanticide did not influence female participation, and nor did the proximity to important feeding sites. But calling context was important, and except for sires who virtually always participated, the other group classes were more likely to participate and participated for longer during intergroup encounters when they had visual contact with their opponents. So we can conclude that among males, cooperative group defense appears minimally impacted by the threat of free riders. And that is because those that incurred the least cost, the adults because they have a full body size, and those that gained the most benefits, the sires, through direct fitness benefits, those were the most willing to provide to collective action. Mutual howling was not explained by kinship patterns or the strength in social interactions, so kin selection and partner competence did not seem drivers behind male participation, and instead mutualism most likely allowed to evolve like cooperation. So instead, cooperative group defense in males may have evolved principally through mutualism, and particularly byproduct mutualism. And such type of mutualism is associated with behaviors that individuals must perform regardless of whether others join in or not. Nonetheless, partners are expected to benefit from coordinating their behaviors, as together they are more effective than if they were to act each on their own. Females participated in over half of their howling bouts, but their participation in collective group defense did not really reflect the defense of infants or food resources. However, we can't exclude yet whether females aim to defend specific food tree species, or that females' participation parallels seasonal availability of certain food items, such as, for example, mature fruits. However, the most intriguing result was that in 4 study groups, one female participated significantly more compared to the other resident females. And it is unclear whether this represents collective action problem with the other females free riding on this one female. And for that, we would need data on age, physical conditions, or long-term reproductive success to estimate the differences in benefits and cost among these resident females. Nevertheless, in another study I conducted on leadership of collective group movements, in only 3 of these groups, this study revealed that only one group member was the habitual leader, and that leader was an adult female. And it now turns out that leading female also frequently participates in calling bouts. And so this suggests that these females seem to have a special role within the social group dynamic that wasn't previously clear in these howler monkeys. Both males and females increased their participation during direct contest with opposing groups, and it is possible that all group members experienced elevated motivation to defend important resources such as fruiting trees. And because the immediate benefits of maintaining access to these resources are most likely evenly distributed among all group members, so this leads to reduced likelihood of free riding among all group members. So overall, I believe that free riding is not a big issue in the collective group defense in howler monkeys.
Hello.
So moving on to the third section and focusing on group level resource holding potential. Evolutionary game theories posit that contests between rivals are settled by asymmetries in fighting ability or stamina, which is collectively referred to as resource holding potential, or asymmetries in their motivation to confront rivals, depending on the value each combatant associates with the resources at stake. However, applying these theories to contests between groups is challenging because it's difficult to estimate groups level resource holding potential or motivation, given that these are properties emerging from group members' behavior. And previous studies have used group size or number of combatants as a proxy of group level resource holding potential, yet numerical superiority does not always lead to winning a contest. And that is because group members and combatants differ in age, sex, rank, physical condition. All those factors could impact their fighting abilities and motivation to participate in group defense. It's also possible that the opposing groups may differ in the expected benefits to be gained from winning a contest. And this might affect groups' collective motivation to escalate conflicts. So ideally, group size, along with the number of combatants, their resource holding potential, and the amount and intensity each contribute, and that in itself depends on their motivation to participate, all these factors should be incorporated in our estimates of group level resource holding potential. But this has not been done, and neither have I. But in upcoming studies, I plan to consider the amount group members call and the acoustic features of their calls to construct such composite group level scores, and to then study how that mediates outcomes and intergroup encounter, how that mediates the outcomes of intergroup encounters, as well as the movement decisions by nearby listening groups. But for now, we only have looked at the effect of numerical superiority. And actually, it's Dawn Kitchen who was the first to examine the effect of numerical superiority in howler monkeys. And she conducted playback experiments simulating the intrusion of unfamiliar males. And for this, she set up experiments that broadcasted either 3 calling males or only 1, and these were broadcasted to groups that either contained 3 adult males or only 1 adult male. And her study revealed that center males were less likely to howl when they were outnumbered. Non-center males did not attend the numerical odds, and females were most likely to howl when their group had an equal number of adult males as the simulated group. However, in a natural study of mantled howlers, and this was done by Mariah Hopkins, numerical superiority did not explain the probability of groups approaching their calling neighbors, and instead a dominance hierarchy among the social groups predicted these approach patterns. And these dominance hierarchies was based on the outcomes of previous intergroup encounters. And Hopkins suggested that when a group encounters extra group individuals with whom they have no prior relationships, as is the case in unfamiliar males in the case of kitchen study, numeric odds might be the best cue for a group to use to estimate their likelihood to win contest. But among neighboring groups who know one another, they might form dominance hierarchies that mediate future interactions. So we set out to examine the effect of the intergroup dominance and numerical superiority among neighboring groups in black howler monkeys in a natural setting. And on the one hand, we predicted that both males and females should call more frequently when they encounter a group of lower rank. On the other hand, we predicted that both males and females should call more frequently when their group outnumbers their neighboring group, and we both considered numerical odds based on males alone, females alone, or both sexes combined. And we are talking here about adult and sub-adult group members. So we used the same study that I explained before that investigated individual participation, but now we are only focusing on those calling bouts during intergroup encounters. And over this 28-month study, we observed 110 intergroup encounters involving at least one of the 5 main study groups, which I show in blue. And they also encountered neighboring groups that aren't studied, here shown in green. And for each of these diets, I show the number of times each group won and the number of times no one wins. Like, for example, in the Balam-Pakal diet, Pakal won 7 times and Balam 2 times, but there were 14 times that no one was considered to have won. And overall, there were 53% of the time there was no clear winner. And we concluded that there was no clear dominance hierarchy among the groups. So we continued only with looking at the effect of numerical superiority. And both males and females were more likely to participate and participated for longer when their group had an equal number of adult males as the opposing group. But there was no effect of the relative number of adult females or that of both males and females. And so we conclude that both males and females have parallel assessment strategies. Now, from the previous result I already explained, we know that calling bouts last longer during intergroup encounters, that all group members are more willing to participate during intergroup encounters. Now, on top of that, when they encounter a group with an equal number of adult males, so that the opposing groups are equally matched, they engage in even longer calling bouts, supposedly because they need more time to assess one another's resource holding potential and motivation. So to conclude, overall, the loud calling is the single most distinctive behavior attribute of the social system of howler monkeys. Adult males, but particularly the sires, are the primary participants, but other group members also participate regularly. And through that, they express a collective interest in defending their resources. They call daily and throughout their home range, and this plays a major role in intergroup communication. Most of the evidence, and although I haven't shown all of it today, but most of the evidence points to defending important food resources and maintaining access to their home range, or at least that seems to be the case in this population. Overall, there is rather an inconsistent result as what is the main function of these loud calls in howler monkeys, and this is true both within and between howler monkey species. And it remains an enigma for primatology what what these loud calls are for. Yet it is hypothesized that they have been under strong selective pressure, resulting in a highly modified vocal apparatus that allows them to produce such loud calls. And through these calls, they most likely convey information on their fighting abilities, their motivational state, and their stamina that allows for the assessment of their rivals, either during direct intergroup encounters or during more distant vocal interactions, which we are starting to understand influence their group level movements. And in my next studies, I will delve into these acoustic features of their calls to study what and how information is transmitted between competing groups and how that mediates into group context dynamics. And with that, I want to thank you, and I'll take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarie. Thank you everyone again for joining us and listening to such an interesting presentation. In case we have any newcomers, let me quickly remind you of the phase of the seminar into which we move now. So after the presentation, we allow ourselves up until 1 p.m. New York time for questions and answers. I ask you that if you have a question, you send it with a question mark. Just type a question mark privately to me, and I will be adding those. I'll add your name to the list of people willing to ask questions. I invite you to try to maintain the dialogue. I mean, we all want to be part of the dialogue. So I will allow myself to discourage you from engaging into chatting conversations that we wouldn't do if we were in person. We wouldn't be talking to the person sitting on the side. We'll just be listening to the questions and answers being asked. So I would like to ask you that if you have ideas, you share them with the whole group. What else? Sarie, if you can stop sharing your screen, that's something else. And I think that's all I have. We already have questions that are coming in like crazy. We should be trying to sell something. Maybe people will be calling and asking to purchase. So Michael Taborski, you're first, and then Jordan Martin, you're second. Sarie, thank you very much. And please, Michael, you need to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, I think. Thank you very much. I have a question regarding your first general question whether the calls of the howling monkeys are meant to somehow assist in intergroup spacing. And if I understood you correctly, your observation that the calls actually attracted or seemed to attract neighboring groups led to your conclusion that this is not a mechanism of spacing out or keeping competitors at bay or neighboring groups at a distance. And I'm not sure whether you can conclude that really if this was not the result of a playback experiment. Because of course, when a group is approaching, the focal group may somehow recognize that another group is nearby and then increase their calling activity. So, I mean, you could also perhaps reverse cause and effect in that relationship. And therefore, I think it is still not unlikely that calling is actually a mechanism trying to keep out neighbors, even though you, from your correlational data, would or could also conclude that it is attracting neighboring groups. What do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Certainly, these loud calls are meant to maintain their home ranges, and there is minimal overlap. And so these calls keep at bay, but it's not that that when they call, their neighbors move away. And perhaps that is what I was mostly interested in. Is like, how does that mediate the movements of neighboring groups? Because it was understood by previous studies on howler monkeys that both groups, the calling one and the listening one, they would just move away, or like if the listening one responds with a call, it would lead to mutual avoidance. But that doesn't seem to necessarily the case. And this was done by studies in the 80s that came up with the hypothesis that the calls in these howler monkeys is a mechanism of mutual avoidance. And so Mariah Hopkins, the study that I touched upon with the mantled howlers, and my own study, then like, well, let's see how neighbors respond when they hear their neighbors. And it turns out also for the mantled howlers that they are more likely to actually approach their neighbors when they hear them calling. It doesn't need to mean that they invade the home range of their neighboring group, and it doesn't always lead to intergroup encounters. But as what we understand now is that it doesn't necessarily lead to moving in opposite directions. And your question about that we need playback experiments, certainly playback experiments can provide very interesting insights, and you can control more factors that you cannot do with natural situations. But if in a playbacks also, groups don't necessarily react equally to a playback because they recognize there's something off with the playback, and then they ignore it, or they don't respond to it. So I don't know, I'm more inclined to see like what's happening with natural interactions between these neighboring groups than say we need playback experiments. But I'm open to that, and I will actually in the one in the next study, when I really want to look at what these calls, what type of information these calls convey, I will include playback experiments to get at the nitty-gritty of the function of these calls. So it's up and coming.
Okay, thank you. I think my point was meant as a general note of caution that if you think of any territorial interaction, the cues and signals that one of the territorial partners shows will increase if the neighbor is approaching. So you will most likely always find the positive correlation between vicinity actually and the amount of signaling. That was my point, that I think it is difficult to really conclude from that positive relationship that there is an attractive function.
But what we looked at is that a neighbor starts calling, and then we looked at in which direction relative to that call, where do they choose to go to, if it's kind of towards or away or not. And we looked at the differences in how far we estimated these groups were, if they were close by or slightly farther away. And I didn't present that, but there was a difference that the closer the group was, the more likely they were to approach, obviously because that group does represent a higher immediate threat because it's closer by. So yeah, in that regard, it could be that at a farther distance, although we didn't see that, they just ignore these neighbors because they are not far, they are not close enough, and they do not represent an immediate threat to what they are doing where they are, right? So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The next question is from Jordan Martin.
Thanks, Sarie. It was a very interesting talk. So if I understood correctly in the data you presented at the end, you showed that males and females were calling longer in response to groups of basically equivalent size. And you suggested that that might be a period in which they're assessing the resource holding potential of the other group. So I just wanted to ask if you could maybe comment on what properties of the calls or maybe like other phenotypes might be involved in that assessment that would lead to the longer calling period being used to engage in that assessment.
Well, that's a topic that hasn't been really looked into, but it's known that through loud calls or through calls in generals, the acoustic features of these calls can say something about the size of the caller, just plain simply body size, which then should link to the fighting ability of this individual. They might also say something about the motivation, how motivated they are, because an easy example to understand is that if you were to be afraid of something, let's say a spider, and you see one, your first reaction is screaming something ugly. And so the features of this call is reflecting your motivational state. And that would be true for their calls as well. There is actually quite a bit of variation in the roars and barks, in that you have several types of roars and several types of barks. And so depending on their motivational state, they might use a different type of roar. And so the listener can pick up on that, and it's like, oh, he's in that state and he's more motivated. And then the other thing that, well, obviously calls can convey so much more, obviously the identity of the individuals as well, but during intergroup encounters, this is not necessary because they see one another and supposedly they know one another. But the other thing I want to point to is their stamina, in that the rate at which you call may say that you are of a higher fighting ability, a higher resource holding potential compared to when you call at a lower rate. And so those are the topics that I want to look into. But these calls also, because they call together, they also say group size and all that. And so it's all still a hypothesis, and it's not really known how it is that they assess one another, and if they do, and how that then influence their decision in terms of the outcome of these intergroup encounters.
All right, thanks.
Next question, Suleima Tang Martinez.
Yeah, hi. This is Suleima from St. Louis, Missouri. I really enjoyed your talk, Sarie, and I guess I have a question and a related comment. The question is, how frequently, if at all, do these bouts of intergroup howling result in actual physical encounters, which I think would be another indication of whether it's really defense or not. But the comment is that I found your talk in the framework really reminiscent of the situation with scent marking in mammals, particularly in rodents, but I'm sure in other taxa as well. And initially, when we realized that scent marking was going on in many mammals, the assumption was that this had to be territorial and that the scent marks would prevent other individuals from entering the area that was scent marked. And then in reality, when we began to look at what was actually happening, whether in the lab under controlled conditions or in the field, it seemed that conspecifics were actually attracted to those scent marks and to the scent marked area. And one possible explanation is that what they're actually doing is collecting information about the other individual, or in your case, other group, including like, do we know these guys? You know, what experiences have we had with them in the past? Who are they? That sort of thing. And I was wondering how you would respond to that analogy between scent marking and howling, and the possible different types of information that could be communicated that would be independent of territorial avoidance, or, you know, trying to keep others from intruding into one's territory.
Starting off with the first section of your question, and how often they encounter, this leads to intergroup encounters. And obviously, I showed it in a graph, and it's not necessarily immediately, you cannot calculate it that fast by just looking at the graph, but on average, there is an intergroup encounter every 3 days. So they
Sorry, I didn't mean necessarily like encounters in terms of groups coming close together. I was referring to aggressive, actual physical aggression happening.
It barely doesn't. During intergroup encounters, so that two neighboring groups meet up or encounter one another, it's very rare that it will lead to aggressive interactions. Sometimes you have chases, and sometimes an individual doesn't see another route of escape than to dropping to the ground, but it rarely leads to a physical interaction. So mostly what they do is like shouting at each one another like crazy, trying to get their message across. What that message isn't necessarily clear to us. When they have encounters with solitary individuals, like a solitary male who tries to take over the group, then it can lead to aggression, because it's the immediate threat is a position within the group, and obviously group members are going to defend that as much as they can. So back to the question of what information they are conveying, it's not clear. It hasn't been studied, although these howler monkeys, I mean, it's in their name. They are known for their calls. There aren't really studies that really get into the nitty-gritty of what this could mean. We know that these calls are extremely low in frequency, and that in itself is linked to body size. And there is variation across the howler monkey species, that those that live in smaller groups and where the competition amongst males is more so coming from outside the group through those solitary males, that these species, and the black howlers are an example of that, these species produce calls that are lower in frequency, which can travel further distance in a forest. So yeah, they are constantly announcing, daily, they are announcing that they are up there, willing to defend their home range. We observed a group that disintegrated, and it started off with one female disappearing, and most probably she died. And the males then decided to abandon the other two females that were left. So those two females were left in their home range, fending for themselves without a male. So although they do call, they don't have that large of a hyoid bone that allows them to produce such calls that travel so far. So they weren't able to reach their neighboring groups, with the result that one male just took over the home range and they got pushed to the side. So it does seem that their regular calling on a daily basis throughout their home range allows them to maintain these home ranges. And so if territoriality, sure, there is territoriality in that. Linking that to scent marking is, sure, scent marking is at least hypothesized to have a similar role, but scent marks last longer, they are deposited. I mean, it's not an immediate cue where someone is. The only thing you know, well, this individual was here recently and might be still here. So there are obviously differences by the two systems, right? But yeah, I would say that it's.
But what I was thinking more is, like you said, you know, they're letting others know that we're here and we're ready to defend. And I would even question if we know that, and whether we could instead interpret what we see and the fact that they approach each other when they're calling as simply a means of exchanging information, not necessarily I'm ready to defend, but more, this is who I am. We live in this area, just letting you know, sort of thing. Numbers of individuals in the group, all of that kind of information without necessarily assuming or arguing that this has to do directly with defense. Obviously, you know, if my neighbor comes out and is out in the backyard and is sort of saying, hey, I'm here, you know, that's communicating to me, hey, that's her area. You know, I shouldn't go in there. But it doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to attack me if I go into the backyard. And, you know, so the defense idea, I'm just wondering if we're maybe making assumptions about defense. And that's why I asked you how often you get aggression when they come to, when you have the shouting bouts, because it would seem that if they are saying, if you come in here, I'm going to beat you up, that, and the other side is saying the same thing, that I would think that you would expect to see more instances in which one side or the other calls the other's bluff, and you do get actual aggression. So it's just a thought. I don't know what you think of that.
Well, my gut feeling is that it is about the defense. I don't think that a group needs to say several times in a day, we are with 7, we are with 7, because the changes in the groups aren't that frequently, yet they do announce daily where they are, with how many they are, and whatever other information they are conveying to their neighbors. So my gut feeling would say it's like, yeah, this is something about defense, particularly with the example that I just gave, that when the males aren't there, the neighboring group just sweeps in and takes over. And so that would be, that's easier. An easier example is like, oh yeah, it does look like that there is something about maintaining a home range, but that is such a haphazard event. You can't really like calculate that into a research, right? So yeah, that would be my gut feeling based on that example. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for your question.
The next question we have from Pedro Diaz. Pedro?
Hi, Pedro Diaz from Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico. Thank you for your fantastic talk, Sarie. I have 2 questions. The first one has to do with this difference between the mantled and the black howlers, where you were saying us that in the mantled howler monkey study, they found that there were actual intergroup dominance relationships. But in the case of your study, you didn't actually identify such relationships. So I would like to hear your ideas about this difference between the two species.
I'll start. Well, first, hi, Pedro. It's been a while that we've seen one another. I'm gonna just give some background for the other non-howler experts in that the mantled howlers that Pedro is referring to and that I mentioned in the talk as well is a sister clade with the black howlers. And they, among all howler monkeys, they are the most diverse or distinct in their social system, in that mantled howlers live in large groups with like up to 6 adult males, up to 15 adult females, if not more, with groups that can up to like 40 individuals. While in black howlers, groups got 12 individuals, 15 the most. And so there is quite a difference in the structure, and researchers of howler monkeys, of which Pedro is one of them, the ideas that we are setting forward is that the competition in mantled howler monkeys is within the group, while in black howler monkeys, it is between groups. And then comes the interesting question, how is it that if in mantled howler monkeys, the competition, and we are talking about reproductive mating competition, is within groups, why should there be a dominance hierarchy amongst groups and not in black howlers? That is your question, right, Pedro? And my response to that would be they are defending important resources, which should be more important in mantled howler monkeys, given that they are with more individuals, more mouths to feed than potentially in black howlers. The study by Mariah Hopkins, which was on Barra Colorado Island in Panama, there is overlap in home ranges among all these groups. Like she had one center group of which the entire home range was shared with neighboring groups. While in black howlers, or at least at Palenque National Park, there is only minimal overlap among home ranges. And I think that is where we have to look at these differences between those two species, or let's just call them those two populations, right? Because I don't know what you see in mantled howlers in Los Tuxtlas, if you see something similar to what is going on BCI, or if it's different. But I was gonna say something else, but it's slipping my mind, so.
Okay, I had another question, perhaps it will lead you there. Traditionally, we have always read that howler monkeys are all about howling, but also all about energy saving. Mm-hmm. And vocal communication could be a very efficient way to avoid these encounters. So it's really surprising that a high proportion of loud calls are responded by approaches. So this kind of counterintuitive to see that they are howling but also approaching. So to me, it's very interesting to listen to this, because mm-hmm. Howlers being howlers, I would expect them to howl and just to sit and wait and nothing more.
Well, as we all know, they can surprise us greatly, these howler monkeys, that they don't necessarily do what we think they should do. And for that, it would be interesting to really look at patterns of howling rate relative to food availability and all that. And one can do that on an annual basis, but I think it would be more interesting and we get more information if we look at a multi-annual type of patterns to really get at the nitty-gritty of how that would influence. So yeah, they seem to, and it would be interesting as well to look at how their behaviors are affected after intergroup encounters. So they do invest quite a bit of time during intergroup encounters by calling, but also by running back and forth and such forth. And does that then lead to resting time, longer resting times the next day or after the intergroup encounter? But I have seen intergroup encounters that last an entire day, and obviously they are not going at it the entire day. They take their rest because they are howler monkeys and they need to like lower their energy. But then when they wake up and they figure out that the neighbors are still there, they are just, it's like, oh, they're still there. And they go at it as if nothing happened before that. So yeah, it is a very interesting question. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarie.
We're going to go now take some questions from our colleagues watching the presentation via YouTube. Alex, I understand that you have something to convey.
Yes, I do. Thank you so much for your talk. And I also have a question myself. So I'm going to start off with that one first. So I was wondering if you saw any difference, or if you looked at if there's any difference between the rates of intergroup encounters for the groups that are in a more disturbed area, because it seems like your field site is kind of like, you know, the center seems like it's maybe like a tourist attraction, or there's at least human activity, and then it seems like there might be secondary growth or primary growth forests beyond. So I was wondering if you saw any differences between those habitats.
We haven't really looked at these differences because we focus on groups that live within the forest, although there are two that live at forest boundaries. And obviously they have less encounters at that site, given that they are not necessarily neighboring groups, although that is not actually true, because then you have like a forest that follows the river, and so you have a riparian forest where howler monkeys live, so they do encounter neighbors over there as well. But for one group, and it's the Motiepa group, which I have mentioned before, and not that you now know this group, but it lives close to the home range, to the forest border, and they overall encounter their neighbors the least. And yeah, it does seem that those are individuals, or a group at least, that do not search their neighbors as frequently, and they are happy with wherever they are, and then they don't have that much pressure coming off from one side of their home range. But yeah, we haven't really looked at that. In forest fragments, generally there is only one group living, and so dynamics should be different, but I haven't looked into that. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, and then we have a YouTube question from Claudio, asking for some practical advice when studying between group competition when your model system is characterized by fission-fusion dynamics. Can you a priori differentiate that the agonistic interaction you're witnessing represents an instance of between group competition rather than an instance of within group competition? And can you define the boundaries of social units at the initial stages of your study before having the opportunity to analyze your behavioral data?
Whew, those are tough ones. With the fission fusion, which howler monkeys are not, and I think that you just the way I would approach it, and obviously it takes quite a while to do that, is to get to know these individuals and know which individual belongs to which community, so that you know whether it's an encounter or an interaction between individuals of the same community compared to individuals of neighboring communities. And our colleagues that study fission fusion dynamics, or primates with this fission fusion dynamics, and it doesn't need to be primates, any animals, I bet they have more sense of how to go about the way I envision it, and I have never done it. It must take quite a bit of time to just figure that all out. Who belongs to who? And so you have to come up with, you can use tools like social network analysis that then allows you to look at who interacts more frequently compared to others, and like what type of interactions, affiliative and aggressive versus only aggressive and all that. So that would be my way to go about it. But the first requirement of that is to actually recognize individuals. So if you can't do that, I honestly have no idea how to go about. Put GPS colors on these individuals and figure it out through that, but that in itself is not easily done. And with that, I forgot the other question.
Okay, I'll repeat it for you. It is, can you define the boundaries of social units at the initial stages of your study before having the opportunity to analyze your behavioral data?
That it depends from species to species, from population to population, in how often they go around in their home range. If within, let's say, 1 month, they cover their entire home range, you can have fairly fast an idea of the size of the home range. But if they, on a seasonal basis, go through their home range, and so after 1 month, you only know one part of the home range, it's very difficult. Now, knowing the difference between those two in itself takes time. So, yeah, I do think that to tackle this, you have to have some information on the population and how they use their space before you can actually start looking at a home range overlap. Now, I think that is the most difficult if there is not that much home range overlap. If you can recognize these individuals, however you do it, because you mark them or you recognize them, and they are a cohesive group that then meets up with individuals you don't necessarily know, or form another cohesive groups, then you can get into like home range overlap estimates. But yeah, it takes time to figure all this stuff out.
Next question from Kaya Tombak. Kaya?
Hello, Kaya Tombak, postdoc at Hunter College, New York. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was very interesting. I was really struck when you mentioned that the loud calls are among the loudest in land mammals. And so it seems that there might be some kind of runaway selection there that indicates that there's some very strong selection on this signal that they're producing. And so I really loved that you sort of tied in participation in the signal to the vested interest in the group on the part of the non-central males. And I'm just really interested in that negotiation, I suppose, between the central and the non-central males, where the central male, if he allows the non-central male to sire some offspring, then he can probably get some participation out of that non-central male and sort of defend his place in the group and in the territory. I'm wondering what the difference is between the central males that allow that and the central males that don't. And I wonder if it's body size? Are the larger central males the ones that try to go it alone, don't allow any of the non-central males to sire, and think that they can just hold their own by vocalizing themselves? Is it related to body size?
We don't know that because we don't have estimates on body size. In the two groups in which we saw that reproduction was shared among the males, one group was two brothers. So then there is like this kinship effect going on. And the other was a group of a father and a son. So also kinship. Now, one would expect, like the reproductive skew models would actually think that it's the other way around, that if there is a kin relationship, that the central male, if he can control reproductive opportunities, then he shouldn't give it to the ones that he is related with, or at least those non-central males shouldn't fight for it because they get benefits, indirect benefits. So we also have to take in the role of females and what role they play in all that, in allowing reproduction if they are interested in that. And females do play a role in black howler monkeys, but they tend to be agreeing with the central male and that they want to copulate more with that central male. And then there were those two cases in which that wasn't the case. So I think that all males and all group members are interested in collectively defending, but then the central male who obtains the biggest benefits actually is the most willing to do so, and then others join him. But it doesn't look like that central males allow reproduction of other central males. These males it seems like they can't care less about if the other male copulates. They are just extremely tolerant to one another, and they avoid one another. Now, we have seen females during intergroup encounters, they go copulate with males of the opposing group in full sight, and these males are just like, yay. And then when the female returns, they start howling as if nothing happened, and they are extremely angry at the opposing group and not angry at that female. And it's like, look what she did. So it doesn't look like that the central male allows things. It just seems that these individuals decide to do things. So yeah, that's my feel of it. Thank you for your question.
The next question, Maren Hook, whose microphone is not working, is asking me, Sarie, to let you know her question. Do you already have any idea where the calls could be an honest signal, in the sense that we think of honest signal within the handicap hypothesis?
No, that is my next study, up and coming. I need some money, so if there is someone who has some funding, like sitting there, like I'm searching for funding. But yeah, no, for that, obviously, Maren, you are right. You have to tackle that one first before you can go on with going about assessments and all that. Yeah, you want to know if it's an honest signal. Good point.
And then we have Leah Prox. I think you do have a question, right?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm Leah Prox from the German Primate Center in Göttingen. And I was wondering, now that you mentioned copulations happening during intergroup encounters, I don't know what the extra paternity rate is in howler monkeys, but would you think that maybe that could even be a reason for intergroup encounters? So as you said, females are howling as well. Mm-hmm. Could individuals even hope to meet other groups to sneak in copulations with the other groups?
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely one factor that plays into intergroup encounters, and I'm not saying that most of the intergroup encounters are because of that, but we have definitely seen females sneaking off and pulling all other group members with her because she is in desperate need of finding a male. That is a female who stayed in her group, and the central male was her father, so that male was just not available to her as a breeding partner, and so she had to search for neighboring groups. She got pregnant by males of a neighboring group. And so aspects that I didn't really talk about, but females stay within their group and males disperse, although both males and females can disperse. And so there are females that still live with their fathers, and we haven't have any evidence of incest. So certainly intergroup encounters provide opportunities for these females. We haven't seen other females who has an unrelated male to their availability, to say as such, to actually go search reproductive opportunities elsewhere. Well, that is actually not true. We had a case with a female and she copulated with whoever. Well, we joked that with whomever moved, but obviously that is not the case, and it was only male howler monkeys. But yeah, she wasn't happy with the male she was living with, and she tried her best with all other males. So yeah, it's a very complex social system.
But it could be maybe so then that they're actually checking each other out during those intergroup encounters, right? So just to see what the state is, the females are in the other group, like the unrelated females, and
yeah, females wouldn't change their from group that easily. So it's not that they are saying it's like, oh, what are the males over there? What is their traits? And I would be interested in moving to that one. That is not the case. But when during intergroup encounters, they might seek opportunities to copulate with males from neighboring groups. Yes.
I stopped right now. Sorry, but one more thing. But maybe if females how they even convey information about reproductive stages in their calls as maybe males do about their body size or something. Okay, now shut up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I am next on the list. So thank you, Sarie, for a wonderful presentation. We had a chance to talk. Well, we talk a lot, but we had a chance to talk yesterday as well about the howlers. For those of you who are not primatologists, just I want to preamble my question with a little bit of background. So howler monkeys are the widest ranging primate genus in the Americas. I mean, going back to the 30s, probably the ones that have been studied the longest. They've been studied from Mexico down to Argentina. They've been studied at sites for decades. Everywhere we go, they howl. And that includes the llanos of Venezuela, the tropical forest, the subtropical. Everywhere you go, they howl. Everywhere you go, they do the same. And we've been studying them for 70 years. We haven't figured out the function of the calls to the satisfaction of our howler monkey experts. So my question, so many of us are jealous of the kind of intraspecific potential that people studying howlers should have. And I know that there have been attempts at drawing from studies of different species of howlers at different sites, but it's also, I get the impression, again, that's where I need you to fill in the gaps, that I get the impression that it happens after the facts. And I wonder if we shouldn't try, and this is something, I mean, it speaks to one of the goals of the seminar of really taking a broad comparative perspective and trying to define the new frontiers of how we're going to study social evolution. Why not develop continent-wide approaches with a priori thinking and methods that compare taxa across ecologies? Could that give us something that we haven't got in 70 years of looking at the howlers in Argentina and the howlers in Venezuela and the howlers? Because any explanation, as you get into the more specific details, any potential explanation will have to account for the fact that howling occurs everywhere. So looking for a very specific ecological explanation, well, if it is because we get these kind of fig trees in Palenque, well, but we don't have those fig trees in Argentina and they still howl. So the question is, you guys with howlers, I mean, we're trying to do a little bit of the same with owl monkeys and titties, but is there something that could be done in trying to understand social organization, social structure with a true comparative multi-species comparison that is carefully designed a priori, not with the facts, not with the data in hand, but what are we going to get that's going to be the same across a range of taxa?
That would be wonderful. And I mean, the only thing that is keeping us from doing it is money, which is the case for all other studies as well, because it would be very interesting to look at it. And I have alluded to this in that in similar studies or different angles of studies on the howling of howler monkeys have been conducted, and they provide information on one specific population that then not necessarily is consistent with what we find for another population, even of the same species. So it would be very interesting to set up a comparative study looking at different populations, different species, different populations, and try to like get at when do they howl, what happens when they howl, what are the consequences of their howling, including acoustics and all that. So yeah, I'm in for that. We are just missing some money, I would say, and obviously collaboration as well. I mean, this hasn't really been talked about among howler monkey experts, so obviously we should start there instead of try to start get funding for it. One of the interesting things that we know already from the studies that have been done is that black howlers and the mantled howlers as well, who live in Central America all the way up to Mexico, they live at the west side of the Andes. And then all other 10 species live on the east side of the Andes. So the Andes formed something like 8 million years before. And so the entire genus has been separated with the clade existing of 2 species, Central American and all the others living at the other side. And interestingly enough, obviously all howler monkeys howl, but the patterning, the temporal patterning of these howler monkeys, those 2 groups of howler monkeys, is said to be quite different in that the black and the mantled howlers, which are the Central American ones, they roar and they bark throughout, like they mix those 2 main types in their calling bouts. While, and I don't have that much experience like personally, but it seems that the others at the east side of the Andes only like either roar, they only roar. And I've been to Ecuador and I've heard red howler monkeys. And even though I am said to be an expert on howler monkeys, I had to ask Tony Di Fiore what I was hearing because I didn't recognize it as a howler monkey. I knew it was something. It sounded to me like the wind. And so there is great difference in what they sound like among all these howler monkeys. So yeah, I would agree. It would be extremely interesting to get a comparative study going.
Thank you, Sarie. The next question is from David Wood.
Hi, Sarie. Thanks for the presentation. It was super interesting. I think these intergroup interactions are really, really fascinating. For those who don't know me, I guess I'm a graduate student of Eduardo's, and kind of related to this her specific comparison. I worked at Lomas Barbadal and Susan Perry's Capuchin project for a year, and I noticed that every time it would start raining, the mantled howlers would start howling. So I wonder if the black howlers that you studied do the same, and what that could possibly be for. Are they just, you know, mad that it's raining and they're disrupted, or could this be, you know, maybe the rain's too loud, so they think, well, I got to let all of the other groups know where we're at if we're going to stay put during this rain. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, my first thought would be is like, well, that's very silly of these mantled howler monkeys, because the black howlers don't do that. I've seen mantled howlers that they react to a motorcycle passing by and they call, and it's raining and they call. And so there is something that triggers them into calling. And I don't have enough experience with mantled howlers to actually say something about it. If it's the sound alone, do they not recognize that these are not howler monkeys? Or is it that, just like you say, that they want alert despite the noise, the background noise, that they are still added to say it as that? So yeah, it is very interesting. And I don't know about the other howler monkey species that like more in the Amazon, the Atlantic forest, and further south in Argentina, if they do that I don't know. But yeah, it is a very interesting observation that these mantled howlers react to noise quite a bit. Yeah.
There is a follow-up question from Suleima. Are there group-specific differences in howls of different groups? Can you identify each group by its calls or howls?
I was reading.
But then Suleima says that maybe you've already answered that.
I was reading something that Tony wrote, that I should come to Ecuador and do exactly the comparative analysis. Well, Tony, I need money, so we can talk about this if you want. So can you repeat that question, Eduardo?
Are there group-specific differences in howls of different groups? Can you identify each group by its calls/howls?
I cannot do that. I don't recognize a group, but there has been a study, and this was also in Palenque National Park by a PhD student who looked at some of the acoustics, and her study was experimental in that she recorded the calls of one group and then either played it back at the side of the home range from where they would be expected, compared to when it was the opposite side. And she looked at the focal group to what extent they would react. One would expect if they recognize their neighbors, they would be more willing to react to the calls of their neighbors coming from the wrong side. And that is exactly what she observed, that they responded more when they came from the wrong side. And that led her to conclude that it does look like they recognize their neighbors. We don't know more in detail if that means particular individuals or not. I mean, it's just like collectively, they do seem to recognize their groups, their neighboring groups.
It also would be interesting to take a call from one area, let's say in Mexico, the site in Mexico, and then play it to animals in your site and see. I would expect that they would have a particularly strong reaction, since they would be total strangers and not neighbors.
Well, that was the study by Dawn Kitchen that I alluded to, in that she did experiments in 3 males that were unfamiliar, but her focus was in like, how do each of these classes of individuals react to that? But overall, they didn't really respond easily to these playback experiments. And one wonders, and this perhaps goes back to what Michael started off with asking, is like, are these playback experiments good enough do these individuals figure it out? It is not real and therefore do not respond. That was my first reaction when I read her papers, in that, well, we've never seen them not react to their neighbors through calls. So yeah, I think that there is a technicality that is not easily teased out. Yeah.
Thanks.
The following question is from Adriana Machado. Adriana, ¿dónde estás? Alejandro, sí.
Hi, Sarie. Thanks for your nice talk. My question is really, it's a small one, I would say, but at the beginning of your talk, you were saying that your framework is set up around ecological fluctuations. And I would assume that it's similar to what happens here in Colombia. We have this seasonality based on rainfall, right? And I was wondering if the rate of calls, they change from season to season. And if that has also something to interplay with changes in group composition and group size, that will be, obviously, I would assume that that will also change from season to season based on breeding of the groups.
I haven't really looked at differences over the season in calling rate. And although I obviously have the data for it and it's so easy to do, I haven't done it yet. So I cannot answer your question whether there is a difference in, let's say, the fruiting season or like the rainy season compared to other times of the year. So yes, I did say that it wasn't within an ecological framework, and it seems that I'm failing on like that little section there. You had another question and I've forgotten.
Right. No, it was like a second part of it was just about, because within seasons you would also expect changes in group composition and group size, then you might see,
No, those groups don't change that frequently in group composition. And so they can stay quite stable, and you have infants being reproduced and others dispersing, but there is not that much turnover. It can be a really fast turnover, but it can be even that fast that it occurs multiple times within a season. And then it only is about the instability that this group is going through, and it doesn't look to be related to any ecological like food availability. But like we have seen that over a period of 3 months, there were something like 4 changes in male members, and it just kept on changing. And we didn't think that that was related to something like food availability or that. And I would think that we need a much bigger data set over many more years to actually tackle that. And my studies have been in bits and pieces to saying that I do not keep on collecting data on who participates on a 1-minute interval, because it's too intense to do that over like a 5-year period. It's just too intense to collect these type of data. So we are missing out on some of the nuances that we would like to answer. So yeah.
Thank you.
Next question, Pedro Diaz again. Where are you, Pedro?
Yes, I am here, but I just sent you a text withdrawing my question.
Okay, thanks. So David Wood seems to have another question. David, do you want to follow up?
I do, not a follow-up, totally new question. I'm wondering if, since howler monkeys seem to have invested so much in developing this really spectacular signaling device, I wonder if there are complementary adaptations in like ear anatomy or brain anatomy that somehow might point to their ability to decode these howling signals.
Well, one would assume that, and I remember seeing a presentation by someone who worked in Costa Rica with mantled howlers, and this was in La Pacifica, that looked at like the hearing ability of howler monkeys. This is a while ago, and I'm not familiar too much with the results, so I might say something that is 100% correct. But if I recall it, it seems like that they were most tuned towards the cries of their infants, which are obviously within group vocalizations and not to the calls or like the roars and the barks. I can't say more than that because I can't remember more. But it hasn't been really explored. It's also a very difficult thing to explore, right? They do not like lift up their hand like, yep, I hear it, still hearing it, yep. So yeah. But there is a study out there about it.
It's already 5-1. We have one more question that we didn't plan it this way, but you'll understand why my point. I'd like to make this our last question so that people don't have to run out of this meeting to the next one. Those who want, we can stay a little bit longer. I wanted to talk to some of you who have asked or suggested that we try to get together for discussing some of the more methodologically oriented issues that have come up through the discussion of comparative studies. So, but for our last question, I would like to give the microphone to our next speaker as well. So the next question is from Jordan Martin, who will be talking next week. He's at the University of Zurich, Switzerland, and next week we'll be talking about comparative approaches to the evolution of human society. So Jordan, you conclude this meeting and you will be opening it next week.
All right, thank you, Eduardo. That was a great introduction to a small question. Sarie, I think I want to pick up on, I believe, Leia's previous point about the function of calls that females might be conveying information about their state to other males and potentially outgroup males. And I wondered whether from the male's perspective, there might also be a signaling function to females where there's a conflict of interest between, say, in-group males who are calling for territorial defense functions, as you've been emphasizing, and potentially outgroup males signaling to females that they might have extra pair mating opportunities with, or I guess extra group mating opportunities with, whether you think there might be the possibility for males to also be communicating with females in other groups.
Absolutely. I mean, these, and that would be true for all animals, I would say, in that when they call, they say so many things to so many potential listeners that it's not unthinkable that within the same call, there are messages for many different types of listeners. And they say, like a female might be interested in a bigger male than the one that lives in her group. Well, the roars will do that, but with their conveying their size, they are talking both to competing males in another group as well as to the females. So yeah, I would agree that females can pick up on that, whether they specifically say something to females and say something to males. Well, that will be difficult to tease apart. But yeah, I do think that, and this will be true for many animals and vocal communication, in that with these calls, they say quite a bit of information to whomever is willing to listen or needs to hear it. So yeah.
Sure, thanks. I definitely agree. I was thinking maybe specifically to Zulema's previous point about scent marking, and some of the research there showing that might also be facilitating mating opportunities, particularly for subordinate individuals, I believe, outside of outside of their breeding groups that they're in, and I think in marmosets. So I wondered if maybe there might be a similar kind of function with the vocal communication for males, setting up opportunities potentially for mating opportunities with those females.
Yeah, perhaps a detail that I didn't really say, although it's an important one, in that we have these central males that initiate most of these calling bouts, and they call during most of the bout. They are pretty loud, and then other individuals join, and so you get some type of cacophony it isn't necessarily clear if messages get across, like saying that we don't see sub-adult males or females calling on their own. So whatever they are saying get masked by howls of other group members. So in that regard, I would be inclined, and we can come back to scent marking, in that perhaps one dominant individual overmarks the scent of other group members, and then it's also get lost. And so in that regard, we are back and it's like, yeah, these systems are similar, indeed. But I don't think that easily groups or individuals that are not central males can really pinpoint a message to other group members, or to other groups rather. So,
Okay, thanks.
So I'd like to officially finish today's meeting. I'll do that by, I think we are going to stop the live stream. We thank you, all the viewers in YouTube channel. Don't hesitate to reach out if you would like us to join us in Zoom. And to all of you at the Zoom meeting,